Well, so good morning, everyone. Thank you all very much for joining us, bright and early as always. I'm Sarah Thomas, the Director of Women in Comms. It's great to be back here in Denver. This is the 6th event we've hosted here, and I think about 14 overall. So the topic today is combating sexual harassment in the workplace, and probably the most important topic we've tackled so far. Just a programming note, we had some last-minute cancellations. In part because of the topic, but also because of weather and things that couldn't be helped. So really grateful that we've had some awesome women step up to the plate and we're going to be sharing their stories with us today. And it's actually worked out really great because we have a lot of different perspectives and backgrounds that we're going to be talking about. So I want to get right to it, but first real quick, my quick plug for Women in Comms. Women in Comms is an initiative that Light Reading launched in 2014, just in recognition of the relative lack of women at events like this. So we wanted to host events where we could bring women together to network and discuss ideas and support each other and hopefully enact some change in our industry. So we've been doing that both online and in our live events once a quarter. And we're thrilled to be supported by about, I think, 45 member companies now, including leading telecom service providers, vendors, and industry associations. So our speakers are also our partners and our members, and we're really lucky to have these women here with us today. As I mentioned, we have 4 really impressive women here joining us. We have, I'll let them introduce themselves shortly, but Executive Producer Janet Leahy. Next to her, we have Kathy Boelter, President of Arrow Solutions Group, and Karen Ashworth Macfarlane, the CEO of Women of Wall Street, and Wendy Bohling, the founder and CEO of corporate Cowgirl Up. And Wendy also is an author and has brought her book here with us today. So we're giving the best question, though they get the book free. So make sure you ask some good questions and you get that as an incentive. I included a picture of my first son when I had an event right after maternity leave, so I had to get the second son in here again as well. But, all right, so the topic of sexual harassment, it's been a really big one, especially in the news lately. It's been a big problem in our industry and others for a long time, and it's good that it's coming to light now and more people are talking about it. There's a lot of statistics I could share about the problem, but just to look at one, in the telecom industry specifically, we did a survey last year of women in comms and found that 1/3 of all women reported having been sexually harassed at their company or at an industry event. And 65% chose not to report it, 37% of whom kept quiet because they're afraid it would hurt their careers. So I think that really highlights, of course, how big the problem of sexual harassment is, but also the problem of not reporting it and the culture of silence around it. As I mentioned, we've hosted 14 of these events and we've never had trouble getting sponsors or speakers, but we had probably 5 women have to pull out because their company's HR departments asked them to. It's either HR or PR, but I'm not going to name and shame because it's probably not that uncommon. I just bring that up because I think it really speaks to how big of a problem staying silent is and not speaking about it for fear of bad press or legal ramifications. So, like I said, we're really lucky that we have women who are willing to talk about it today. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and we'll ask some questions, and then we'll leave the last 10 or 15 minutes for audience questions. So, if you have one that's burning, feel free to raise your hand, but we'll definitely get to it as well. So I'm going to come join you all over here, too. To start, I think we'll just go down the line, ask you all to introduce yourselves, and maybe tell us a little about your background and your story. So, Wendy, we'll start with you.
So my name is Wendy Bohling. I spent 30 years in telecom, healthcare IT. I'm an extroverted engineer, which is weird anyway, right? Unicorn. I ended up having a pretty substantial experience reporting sexual harassment and being retaliated against for 18 months until I was fired from a Fortune 100 telecom company 20 years into my career. It was actually, in hindsight, a blessing in disguise. I went on to do some really cool things, got to found and be part of a healthcare startup and then run sales for some software telecom companies. And it's been a fabulous 30-year career, but 3 years ago, I ended up leaving a healthcare startup and I was looking for my next role and had 3 fabulous opportunities here to run sales for 3 mid-sized software companies, tech companies in the telecom space. And I got through all 3 of the interviews and then got to the CEO interviews and ended up in all 3 cases, I would be reporting to that CEO. And and it was so much sexism and bias in those interviews that I stepped back and said, I think I'm done. I hit a wall and said, maybe I need to be a part of this solution instead of working in it. So I ended up stepping back and writing this book, Cowgirl Up, A Woman's Guide to Navigating the Corporate Frontier. The sexual harassment chapter is called Spit and Tobacco and Other Disgusting Cowboy Habits. So they have interviews with 48 fabulous gender-intelligent leaders that are incorporated all through the book. But the last 2.5 years, I've been working in business to try to change the culture around this and to give both men and women equal access to thrive, as well as speaking all over the country, and have been so lucky to meet women and gender-intelligent male leaders that are making a difference around this topic.
Right, Karen? Hi, my name is Karen Ashworth Macfarlane, and I am currently the CEO of an consulting firm called Women of Wall Street. I came from Wall Street. I spent about 15 years as an entrepreneur, sold my company, and became a financial advisor, and then went into senior leadership for several different Wall Street firms, and one of which was in the Silicon Valley. So we did the Google IPO, I did the Visa IPO, so very involved with the technology side of the world as well. And probably 10 years into my leadership roles, I was diagnosed with cancer, and they had just done an employee opinion survey, and I got back, and I had gotten an 87%, which is pretty difficult to do on Wall Street as a woman managing 99% of men. And within 3 weeks of returning from treatments, I was demoted, and with an 87% score, one of the highest in the whole company, and was, talked into a quote-unquote promotion, which was truly a demotion. I went from 250 direct reports to 0. And then a bunch of the women at the firm actually filed a complaint on behalf of all the women at the firm. And I was an executive advisor along with another phenomenal woman. And within 2 weeks of that formal complaint being done, we were both let go for different reasons. So it was clearly retaliation. And having experienced that, I couldn't go back. I mean, I left and I didn't go back just because it was such a non-inclusive environment. And ironically enough, I had sat on the board at a different firm with the CEO. He handpicked 8 women to help him identify how do we hire, retain, and promote more women. And so I spent a year working closely with the CEO of Morgan Stanley, and it was a fascinating thing to do. And I'll tell you more stories about that as we get into more details of things that we discovered that works around sexual harassment, sexual discrimination in the workplace. But it was very, very interesting. So I left, and now I consult for people to help them, as Wendy knows, really understand how important financial planning is and get an unbiased opinion on how to find a good financial advisor and how important it is. And you don't have to be an expert in math, as most of us know. But the reality is, I think it's only a few people that are doing the wrong things. I will say I think most men and women do their very, very best to be inclusive and work together. So I think it's really up to those of us that are sensitive to this and all the good men out there, which is most of them, far, far, far more than just a majority, and have people call out the people that are doing the things that are inappropriate. I think it takes men to call out men, and I think it takes women to call out men, and women to call out women. I mean, it goes both ways. So I think it's really about opening up the communications and understanding our differences in terms of gender and respecting those differences and learning how to work together more efficiently. So that's my story for now.
Good morning. My name is Kathy Boelter. I started a firm called Arrow Solutions Group. We're an IT staffing company, and we support cable and telecommunications. It's one of the sectors that we work with. So we put out contractors, IT people, engineers. And I actually wasn't scheduled to be on this panel, but I sat next to Alan yesterday at lunch, and he he said, oh, we have this panel in the morning. And I said, oh, yes, I'm scheduled to attend. And he said, would you consider speaking? And my first reaction was definitely no, or, apprehension, because this is a polarizing topic in the workforce. I mean, it's, it definitely happens in my 25-year career. Certainly earlier in my career, it was a lot more overt, but you see it not so much now that, I run my own firm, but certainly over the course of my career, if any of, a lot of us have been in sales, from your clients, primarily I would say clients, actually, because it oftentimes comes from a person who believes they're in a position of power over you. So I wasn't exactly easy about speaking about this, or very comfortable, but there were two things that made me sit back and say, this is an important topic. And then the first thing is that I have a young daughter, a late life child, and I want her to be strong and know how to address these right from the get-go. And if I can't stand up and speak for women, what good am I as a mother, really? And the second thing is I'm an employer. Everybody knows that a lot of people in STEM, so everybody who works for me is an engineer or in IT, and the majority of my workforce is men, and I want to be an employer who educates, although, I guess Wendy will speak a little bit about training and education, but making sure that I know how to address issues if they come up in the workplace. As an owner, I want to make sure that I'm putting out a message that that kind of behavior is never tolerated. So look forward to the lively discussion.
Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Leahy. I'm a television writer and executive producer. I've been doing it about 30 years. I did a show you might have heard of course. I worked on The Cosby Show and Cheers and Roseanne, and I did comedies for about 18 years, and then I transferred over to dramas and ran a show called Boston Legal and was executive producer, but not showrunner, on Mad Men. I have an interesting, funny story I can tell you in a minute about how things have actually changed from the start of my career. But I can tell you from our experiences at Mad Men, one of the things we did was write about this issue, clearly, that took place in the 60s. But those stories came from our lives, and from many of our lives, and from friends' lives, and because a lot of things had not changed. And so we just put them in that period, which was alarming to us to find out that we weren't alone, and it was still very prevalent. But it gave us great pride to bring it up.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah. My second question was about asking all about if the problem is as bad as it seems in the media. It seems like we've already answered that a little bit, but Janet, a lot of what we've heard in the press lately is from your industry. And so I'm curious, is it still as bad as it was in the tech industry and everywhere, or are things changing for the positive? Maybe you can start with sharing your story that you mentioned, Janet.
I think it's, clearly, the Harvey Weinstein thing, in a weird way. Thank you, Harvey Weinstein, because I say that, obviously not, I'm saying that facetiously, but it brought a watershed to not just our industry. It started with our industry, but then every industry, every profession is now checking and rechecking. And I've lived long enough to see this cycle through every generation. And at first it was disheartening. I said, oh, here we are again. Anita Hill before that, in the 70s and before that. But I'm realizing that every time this cycles and comes up as a shock, more and more truth is coming out. And people are not holding back, and stories are being told. To give you an example of how it was handled, my first job was as a secretary on a show called Newhart. Bob Newhart had a show called Newhart that took place in Vermont. And we worked at a little company called MTM that made the Mary Tyler Moore Show that some of you will know. And there was some other dramas. And some of the other secretaries came to me and said, we're being harassed on set. The executive producers are grabbing our breasts. And I was like, well, we can't let that happen anymore. Let's not do that. But they were afraid because they wanted to be writers, because that was a little known route, very little known way to move up. But I couldn't sit with it because once you know something, you can't sit with it. And that's the main thing that we have to understand. Once you know information, it is incumbent upon you to act. Otherwise, it's going to eat you away. So I went to the head of HR. It's this very small company. Her name was Mary Jo Ballerini. And I knew her, and I said, Mary Jo, this is what's happening. Now, this is in the 80s. This is before Anita Hill. This is before any legislation. There was nothing that could be done because this is a very powerful producer of a drama that was a very big hit show. So Mary Jo did whatever she could, and she just decided to go on set to the executive producer and grabbed his crotch. And she just kept grabbing his crotch. And he was like, what's going on? She says, now you know how it feels. We can't do that now, but we've come a long way. At least there's legislation and there's things we can do. But the main thing is you can't not say anything because it will eat you. So,
Yeah, wow, that's one way to handle it. Anybody else want to comment?
I think the biggest thing I've learned is how to respond when things happen. And the best way I've figured out how to do it without grabbing somebody's crotch, because that is way attractive thing to think about doing to get back at people. But it is instead, how would you feel if someone did or said what you just said to your daughter? And that's the best thing I've seen. 26% of companies actually have a gender equality or some kind of a initiative around gender equity. And when I looked at which companies did, it was it seemed to be the CEOs that had daughters was the one thing they had in common. So I think, I mean, I'm not sure the men in this room are the ones that need to hear us be talking. It's the ones out there that need to get in here, but it's, I think it's, you want to do it with class, and I've just learned how to, once I had a male at a Vaughn Voice on the Net conference asked me had any work done up here. And I said, I sure have. I had a crown and a root canal just last week. And you just learn to kind of roll with it and look at them like, you're so dumb, right? And just try to put them in their place in a way that they would understand. And then you get serious after you joked a bit and say, what if somebody said that to your wife? So.
Well, and I also think, back to, it's really important to say something and be able to go to the HR department wherever you work and know that you won't be retaliated against. I think one of the biggest issues that we face in pretty much every corporate environment is a lot of companies, and I know my industry, and I think the technology industry is pretty strong in this too, is part of arbitration agreements. So if you become an employee at most any Wall Street firm and a lot of the big technology firms, you sign an arbitration agreement. So if you have a complaint, you can't go public with it because it's bound by arbitration, and so nobody ever knows. And I was reading an article recently that on average about 5,000 women a year file complaints against Wall Street firms, and nobody knows about it because it's bound by arbitration. And then the secondary thing is the fact that when you settle with a company for discrimination or harassment or whatever the case may be, they get hush money. And then they're bound by non-disclosure agreements. Mm-hmm. So I think until we see, and it's a cultural shift that needs to happen, but I think unfortunately those two issues really keep culture in place and not positive culture, because until it's not okay to not be able to go public with it, and it's not okay to have to be silent about it, nothing's really going to change because people know they can, I hate to say this, but get away with it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know anybody in my old business that didn't have to sign an arbitration agreement. 99% of the time, we didn't even know we were signing them. It was just part of the employment agreement that you signed when you walked in the door. But the hush money that we keep hearing about from all of these women that are coming forward, now, one of them suing our current president so that she can speak about what happened, and it'll be interesting to see how that if she prevails or not. But nonetheless, until those things change, the culture is not going to shift. I mean, because there are some things we can't control, like unconscious bias, because as we talked about earlier, and I'm kind of stepping into another part of it, but unconscious bias is so strong, and we're all guilty of it. I'm guilty of it. Men are guilty of it. It just happens. I mean, I'll share a quick story with you. When I was on this advisory council to the CEO at was what then Smith Barney, now Morgan Stanley, great group of people. We put our male senior leaders through what we called gender equality training. So the 8 of us women then were tasked with going to our bosses and asking them how they felt about the training. And so we interviewed all of our bosses separately. And 100%, and I'm not exaggerating, 100% of the men, including my boss, said it was fabulous training, but I didn't need it. And I know for a fact some of those men, I know of them sexually harassing several of us. And I thought, how can you not need it if I know that you've done it? But that was their perception, was that it was great training, but they didn't need it. So I think the training's important, I think, but I don't know that it necessarily works, because I don't know that it changes the culture. So until we really can change the laws around protecting the corporation instead of protecting the people, we're going to have an inherent problem. And I've been saying this for a long time to a lot of people, but my goal is to put people before the corporate structure. And if we put people first, the statistics have proven over and over again that you're going to have a happier company, you're going to have a more successful company, you'll have a more diverse group of people working together. So there are a lot of really good solutions out there. It's just going to take time for these changes to occur, and I'll be pleasantly surprised when arbitration agreements go away. And clients are bound by them too. Our clients are all bound by arbitration agreements for the most part, which isn't necessarily fair, because I don't know if any of you have ever sat through an arbitration, but that was part of our training. And I sat through several of them, and it was 3 people that were retired and knew nothing about the industry. And I thought, how are they making decisions that affect someone's entire life or portfolio or future? It just made no sense to me. And then they come up with some sort of agreement, and they can never discuss it. And, I have 3 sons and 1 little granddaughter. And I'll tell you, my boys, when they watched what happened to me, they're like, Mom, you need to go public. Mom, you need to sue these people. I'm like, I can't. There's nothing I can do. So it's a culture that needs to shift, and I think it starts with our legal system, and at least in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on the 2 big aspects. It's the company culture that allows it to continue, and then policies like that, which actually mandate it, to the silence around it. Let's focus a little on the company culture aspect of it. Maybe we have a little more control over that. What are some elements that you see of a positive company culture, and how can we go about maybe changing it if companies don't have that already? Kathy, maybe you can speak to that as a CEO of a company. When you thought about culture and all that, is that something you purposely thought about diversity and inclusion, or is it something that kind of happens as you go along?
So first I'll say we have arbitration agreements in our company too, because obviously, it covers more than sexual harassment, but, companies, as you know, need to protect themselves in a lot of ways. And the other thing that I want to say just before I jump into that is that I read something in the 87% of people, like public, believe that it's the responsibility of a company or it's a company's responsibility to kind of manage sexual harassment. So it's not the responsibility, the public sees it as the responsibility should be of the company to kind of make sure that you don't have a culture of that allows sexual harassment. Does that make sense when I say that? Yeah. So I think that the perceptions out there are starting to change to kind of say, and whether it's, how do we jump that into culture, into education? In a lot of ways, I think it starts with the values of a company. And I run a small business, and a lot of my workforce is billable out at our clients. And so, you hope when you're hiring people that they're representing you in the best way, and your organization and the values of your organization in the best way that they can. It's not much different when there's you have an internal culture too, but we're trying to put ourselves out there. This is the way we represent our company. This is our work product. This is how we act professionally. I think it's probably easier to control with a smaller company, maybe than with a large company, because you get one or two bad seeds. And I'm not going to say at all that the majority of men out there are bad. I think that there's a couple that really ruin it for everybody else. What I will say that has changed, particularly like in my career, the workforce is much more casual. My workforce, even my internal workforce, they're all Facebook friends, they are texting each other after hours. The kinds of social events that they want to do with each other are just a lot more casual than maybe earlier in my career, where you always went out for steak dinners and like cognac after. Do you remember those days? Like the social side of it is different. So I think that the opportunity to cross the line it looks different than it did maybe like when you're talking about the early days. Like to be promoted, you have to exchange sexual favors. I don't see that as much, although maybe I don't see it now. But I do see coworkers and like I said, even clients who maybe, you're in more casual situations that aren't necessarily a work environment, and that's where I sometimes see people crossing the line. And as an employer, that worries me a little bit, because am I responsible? I mean, so I'm trying to look at it from a different lens too, right? And how do I create, again, a culture and education around, like, it doesn't matter if you guys are together as workers, there still needs to be a professionalism and the way you conduct yourself with each other. Does that make sense? I'd welcome other dialogue, for sure.
Yeah, that was something we saw a lot on Wall Street, because we'd all get together after hours, and they actually came out with policies that the same rules apply when you're off your work site that when you're on the work site, which I think is fine. I mean, but I also think we need to be careful, because in talking to a lot of people about this over the last several years, because I was CEO of a gender leadership company for about a year and a half, and we found it really challenging to figure out how do we deal with gender equalities, lack of, getting rid of sexual harassment, discrimination in the workplace. But if you don't, really honor those quote unquote rules in all situations, things do get out of control to some extent. But men are starting to feel scared, from what I can see as well, which is not fair either. I mean, how many people, met a spouse or dated somebody that they met at work? It happens all the time. It's not unusual. So I think men are afraid to even ask women out on a date, which is fine. That's not sexual harassment. So there's definitely a very black and white line there. But I think you're right in expecting people to have a professional demeanor off-site unless they want to start dating. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as it's consensual.
I was just going to say, I had a personal policy of not socializing with like several people, including my time on the Cosby Show, which I think helped dodge a bullet for me. Seriously, that I stuck to the job, and we were so busy that if somebody asked you to go out to dinner, I just would refuse. I would just say, "I'm so sorry, I'm busy," and you really were. But on the other hand, the other side of that, and I know in corporate life, if you're not socializing, then you're not presenting an opportunity for promotion. The classic was the golf course, right?
Right, exactly.
And so there's a other side of that coin. So you almost have to be better at your job if you're going to draw those lines. But I found that it personally helped me dodge a lot of bullets.
So I think none of this changes until there's more women at the table, and that takes a lot of intention. I mean, there's all this research that says if you have 5 people, it just came out, it's called 2 in a Pool, from CU Boulder, actually. If you have 5 candidates and you have one underrepresented person, if that's one woman or one African American or one gay or lesbian person, if there's one of that people in that 5, that pool of 5, statistically 100%, you will not hire them. You cannot turn the bias that's inherent unless you have two of that type of candidate in the pool. And that takes a lot of intention. So you have to look at every single people process you have in your entire culture, and you have to be intentional about figuring out how are you going to embed in those processes things that are going to be intentional about ensuring you get a candidacy and across representation. But sexual harassment is totally different than bias. Bias hurts. It's like water torture over time. It's like death by 1,000 cuts, right? It's the reason 57% of mid-career women are leaving tech. That's twice the exit rate of men. The bias is the more subtle, right? But it still impacts your career. And I had a young, and I thought the millennials had this whipped because, you know, I mean, my son has seen me, you know, badass Wendy be out there making her own way, right? And yet that's not the case. In fact, the millennial women are telling me when I'm speaking, Wendy, men your age are better advocates for us. And I keep wondering why. And it's probably because the women in their life haven't really experienced bias to the point where they're complaining about it every day to them. But I've seen 24-year-olds, 27-year-olds just last week came and they're done. They work at in the cable industry. They said, I'm done with this. And so they're getting tired of it sooner. And so I think culture has to be not just don't grab people and don't hold things over their head, but also don't, it's a lot more important. It's how we show up as gender intelligent leaders that are gonna call behaviors out no matter what happens. I mean, it's been shown that if a woman gets spoken over at a meeting, if another woman stands up for that woman, they're seen as being, oh, you're a little sensitive, right? You're being a little sensitive about this. If a man speaks up about that happening, like, hey, Joe, Wendy was talking, let's let her finish. And you don't have to be, you know, badass about it. And, Joe, don't be a dick. You know, you don't see that. But instead, they will listen to the men and the behavior will change. So.
Well, I think a lot of this needs to start being very solution-focused.
Yes.
And I think it's a culture that will start the shift. And two of the things that we implemented at Citigroup, which used to own Smith Barney, when I was on that group with the CEO, we did two things. We did what we call blind hiring, and I know Citigroup still uses that. And so if, you know, resumes, hundreds of resumes come in for a position, we actually take the name off of there because you can learn so much from a name. And so you're really, truly looking at who the person is, what their credentials are, and if they're an appropriate fit. The second thing we did is we were noticing, you know, some of the women that had phenomenal report reviews from their superiors were not necessarily getting promoted. So what we implemented also was we did a grading system. So we, you know, it wasn't just outstanding, and I can't remember all the different factors, but we actually gave everybody grades. And so you had an A+, an A, an A-, B+, and so on. And the hiring manager was tasked with only looking at the grades of all of the people internally, because these are obviously internal candidates, and looking at the grades and picking people to interview that had the top grades, and it didn't matter what their name was, it didn't matter what their gender was, it didn't matter what any of those things meant. So that's truly unconscious hiring, and that's unconscious, not unconscious, but there's no unconscious bias rolled into that hiring or promoting when you don't know who the person is other than their credentials, which is what we're all looking for. I mean, and so those were two solutions that I saw worked really, really well. Not always, of course, not 100% of the time, but I think we need to really quit talking about all that's wrong. We all know what's wrong. And really start looking at solutions. And it starts at the top. I mean, it really starts with the culture, and most people, men and women, are very sensitive to these issues and are just wondering, how do we implement it? And those were two programs that I saw work really well, and from what I understand, I'm no longer there, but from what I understand, they're still doing that, which I think is absolutely terrific.
Yeah, let's talk more about solutions. Both, I'd love to hear more advice on both from an individual level, things that work for you in your career, and also what you think companies or the industry at large can do that's going to have a positive impact on overall culture and combating these issues. You want to just go down the line, Kian?
For me, it was having, because I worked in a writer's room, there'd be 8 or 10 people in the room producing the show. Excuse me. If there's two women, the culture changed. And recently, this was fascinating, I was working on an HBO half-hour show, comedy, and there were only men in the room and me. And then the next week, another woman and an African-American, he's not African-American, he's Ethiopian, gay man showed up. The entire culture shift in the room. The jokes changed, the attitude changed. Sometimes there'd be slip-ups, I'm being quite honest, they'd say a gay joke and then this humiliation would come over their faces. It wasn't because these were bad-intentioned people, it's just they didn't have to face the people that they were making jokes about, and they didn't have to address the issue. So it all changed. The show was still great, it was still funny and whatnot. So that's the biggest factor, the number of individuals who are of a different culture, race, gender. Big difference.
So diversity in general and having maybe more women in leadership roles as well would help, and just more on the table.
Always, because
Yeah.
the whole culture shifts.
So we talked a little bit about company culture and, how we, I guess, promote, solutions. In my career, a lot of the time that I've experienced any kind of harassment has been one-on-one, maybe outside of work or whatever. And I think really, I don't know if I want to say teaching women, but the biggest way that I would change it is to say something back to them, kind of like you said. So that's what I would say to teach, like my young daughter, like the confidence to just say, hey, like leave me alone, or stop being whatever. Step up and say something back to them. That surprises people. So I don't know, my experience less in the corporate America side, like where I saw it. I've never had my direct boss do anything. It was outside, like somebody else. So I think, I don't know how we teach women to, it's not just confidence, but maybe it is. I mean, Wendy and I were talking earlier about how do you step up to it in a one-on-one setting, essentially. And so that's what I would say. I'd like to see in my world solutions focused around just giving women somehow the confidence to just say no,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with everybody. And when I experienced it, which was quite often, I would just say no. And I still had a great relationship with those men. And I just shut them down, and they didn't try again. But the discrimination
sometimes
is
they
the
actually
harder
respect
part.
you. It's almost, I found that sometimes when you step back up and say, oh, come on, give me a break, go back to your wife or whatever, you know what I mean? They almost, it changes the relationship because the dynamic between the two, right, you're putting yourself on a plane of equal power. They're trying to, have power over you, and you want to be equal. Sorry, I didn't mean to, but I was saying, yeah.
That's true. And I think, I look back on when I was talking to my boss about the gender equality training that they had gone through, and he had said, oh, it was great, but I didn't need it. I then said, let me share a story with you. I said, there's a female leader in Ohio, I think she was. I can't remember exactly where her office was, but she looked at her regional director one day, and they were all at their regional meeting. It was just all managers, and it was, mostly men and a couple of women, and two of the men were missing. And so her male boss said, oh, Joe and Brian, I know they're at this bar, and I know they're watching this football game, and he's texting them, get back here, you're late for the meeting, it's starting again. And she looked at him and she said, if I were not here right now, would you have any idea where I was? And he said, no, I really wouldn't. And she said, and do you even have my cell phone to text me? And she was in the exact same level as these two men that were late. And he said, no, I wouldn't. And she said, I play golf. I like to drink beer after work. And we've never had lunch, just the two of us, to the Mike Pence comment. And he said, oh, I'm really sorry. I'll try and be more conscientious of it. So I'm sitting here sharing this story with my male boss. I just received an outstanding performance review. We're just having a lovely conversation. I'm sitting in his office in San Francisco. The market opens at 6:30 on the West Coast, so we eat lunch by 11:30. So it's 11:30, sitting in downtown San Francisco. I'm heading back in a few minutes to my office on the peninsula. And I looked at him and I said, and we just had this conversation, and he said, wow, Karen, you're right. Well, no, I don't have lunch with the guys that often. And I said, David, we've never had lunch. And I said, and I'd love to play golf. He says, oh, I didn't know that. And then he looked at me and he said, I don't know if my wife would approve of my having lunch with you. This was like 3 or 4 years ago. And I said, and then he looked at me and he said, and what would Scott think, my husband? And I said, well, I can assure you my husband would be fine with it. I work for you. Anyways, it's now 11:30. He looks at me, I swear to you, and says, it's 11:30. I've got to run. I've got to go grab some lunch before I have my next meeting. And it's my fault for not having said, excuse me, why don't you and I have that first lunch together? And he walked out, and great meeting, good to see you again, all that. And I just thought, but I didn't say anything. And that's my fault. He didn't pick up on it, but neither did I. I walked out and thought, oh, you idiot, why didn't you say, okay, David, let's have lunch today? And he would have said yes. There's zero doubt in my mind. But both of us was his unconscious bias, my unconscious bias to some degree, and my lack of confidence to look at him and say, we're doing it still. You're doing it still. So we as women have to speak our minds. We have to, and we don't have to be polite about it if it's a situation where you need to be a jerk. Go ahead, speak your mind. I think women tend to be a little bit afraid to speak their mind because they're, considered bitches. But a man, like you said earlier, says something and everybody in the room pays attention. They're great leaders. And we're women that are disruptive or too opinionated or something like that. And they've done studies on it. I mean, I'm not just saying this. If a woman says something and the man says the exact same thing, the response from the room is entirely different. So until we change those unconscious biases as well, and it's really hard to do. My female boss, and I'll share this story, and Wendy's heard it, so I apologize, she has to hear it again. My female boss at, I won't say where, one of the Wall Street firms, we had a woman CEO for a little while on Wall Street at a huge firm. She was awesome. She still is awesome. And we're in New York City, we're at the MoMA, and it's the manager's meeting. We've had our all-day meetings, and we're having a celebration that night at the MoMA. And we're all dressed up. My husband's in his tuxedo. I'm in my long dress. And she walks up to my husband, and she's like, hi. I won't say her name. My name's so-and-so. What's yours? And my husband says, Scott Macfarlane. And she said, so how are you? What did you think of our meetings today? And he said, I don't know. I wasn't there. And she just stops, and she just turns beet red, and she's angry. She said, what, were you playing hooky? And he said, oh, no, I wasn't playing hooky. My wife was there all day, though. Maybe you should ask her. And she and I have talked about it since, and she said, oh, my God, I'm such an ass. I said, excuse my French, that is what she said. And I said, no, you're not. But you assumed because 99% of the room all day was men, that man was one of the managers you just hadn't met yet. And instead, she hadn't met me yet. And so we have to pay attention to those kinds of things. Don't walk into a room and assume that the man is the reason the woman is there. It could be the man's there because the woman's there. And they had all these activities planned for the spouses because the spouses were clearly invited. My husband looks at the schedule and he said, my God, these are all for women. I said, well, honey, you're one of the few men that are here as a spouse. So he went off on his own and did his own activities in New York. But those unconscious biases are really strong, and we're all guilty of it, every single one of us.
So if we're talking about culture, I think, especially around sexual harassment, it's all about power. And right now, the executive suite is male-dominated. There are actually more men named David than there are all women CEOs. So when we think leader, we think men right now. So men, I'm going to speak to you for 1 second. You have the responsibility to change this culture. You're the only one that can. And that means wanting to learn about what it's like for the only woman in the room that's on your executive team, and for actually asking how that feels and what you can do differently to support them, and to also find out in your organizations what it's like for those for those women. There's a cable company that has a culture that the women are trying to get me to come in and help fix, where it is consistently the men speak over the women, and it's accepted. And so finding out what your culture is for those women, how would you even do that today? I'd probably go ask them, what's the culture like? And make it a conversation where I really want to know. There'll be no retaliation. So this is really up to you. I have had my whole career feeling like the onus was on me to act like a man to be successful. And and I used to think, especially after I went through the shame of reporting sexual harassment and being retaliated against, and after 18 months thinking, I'm the problem, there's got to be something to this. I must be the problem. Because this isn't getting fixed. I just couldn't believe that someone wasn't going to fix this, that I was being blackballed. And to go through that has given me such compassion and strength around talking to executives about how to not let this be the case. I do believe that the majority of men don't do this intentionally. There are predators out there. Women say to me all the time, this awful boss I had, a male boss, and I said, was he an asshole to everybody, or was he just an asshole to women? Because he could not be sexist, he could just be a butthead. So, we're going to have bad leaders, right? But there's a whole difference between wanting to understand how you come across to people, and that's where culture starts. And you can create a culture in your own little bubble. You don't have to have the CEO do that. You can do it in your whole organization. If you have no women in your group, go find them. Call me. I have a terrific network of 10 years ago, I started a Coolest Women in Tech group for director level and above. Because so many women were exiting the industry, I wanted to do something to stop it, and giving them that kind of community when you're so isolated every day, day in, day out. So talk to me if you want to be part of that group, women, but you got to be cool. You can't suck the life out of people when you walk into a room. So, but that's about having a good culture too. It's how are you improving the ability for women and men to be able to speak up about what's holding them back from being successful. Because every time we fix one of those, like even with a pay gap, it actually pulls up all other underrepresented groups as well as men. When Salesforce found that they had a $3 million pay gap, he fixed it in 3 months, Benioff did. But when they looked, 50% of the people that were not getting paid correctly were actually men. They got their salaries corrected. So you're doing this for you because anything you do to improve the culture is going to actually help you in being the engaged, family-oriented man that can leave and see their kids play soccer or whatever that takes. Mm-hmm. But you can tell I'm not excited about this subject at all.
Great. Well, that's a good place to pause too and see if we have any audience questions. Start right here.
I have a few questions. One is, I love this panel. I love the discussion. It's so healthy. It's so needed. But we have no rules. I know there are young men who are going to therapists to find out how to date women because they don't know how to approach someone in the workplace or otherwise. We don't seem to have clear boundaries of what's breaking the law and what's just unethical or wrong. We don't have a sense of how long should something that happened in another culture at another time we be held accountable for. How do we get clarity as to what boundaries are when the boundaries seem to be very ethereal?
If you wouldn't have the behavior and want and have your wife sit there or your daughter sit there and see it, if you feel guilty at all about that behavior, you shouldn't do it. It's easy. I don't think this is hard. This is zero tolerance to me, but.
Well, it's also
Yeah, I
true in other times there were courting rituals. There were rituals in societies, and there were clear rules. You're absolutely right. I think we need to find some more. I feel like, and I've had this discussion with one of our prominent leaders in the House of Representatives. We need to all be thinking about ethics, ethics, ethics in all of our behavior. It's not just women, it's how are you behaving in business? And don't look to the leadership of the country. You look to your own behavior. But we need almost a coming back to, like what you said, sort of a group idea of what's acceptable and what's not. Maybe we can look to the past, I don't know. But it's certainly not working right now, so.
Well, yeah, and like I said earlier, I think men are starting, like, to your point, I think, is you're afraid to ask a woman out. You know, is that going to violate a policy at your firm? And it's all about communication. I think if you sit down with your HR department or have company-wide meetings to talk about this, why not? There's nothing wrong with having this conversation within your organization. And if you're not in the C-suite and you wonder how to make that happen, go to the C-suite, ask them, say, you know, I'm, with all the conversation around all of this right now, I think everyone's a little confused. So open communication is always the key to solving questions like that. And it's a totally legitimate question because I'm hearing it from a lot of different people. It doesn't matter where you are within an organization in terms of hierarchy, you know, you want to make sure you're playing by the rules, right? And the rules haven't changed. And, you know, to Wendy's point, you know, if you wouldn't want your wife or your daughter or your sister to witness the behavior, you should probably not do that behavior. And it's kind of like the old saying of, you know, don't put something in an email that you wouldn't want everybody you love and care about to read. That's a form of behavior as well. So, you know, just look at it from an ethical point of view, because I think if we go back to our core values as human beings, you know, we'll know the answers. But have the conversation. I mean, I think people are so afraid in corporate America to have an open dialogue about this kind of thing like we're doing here today.
Right.
Have the men ask the women, have the women ask the men. You know, have the women need to know what the men's expectations are, the men need to know what the women's expectations are, professionally, personally. They are different.
Am I out of bounds, right? I'd like to talk to you about something that I'm feeling a little uncertain how to bring this up, right? I mean, I don't know any person, male or female, that if you're that vulnerable, they wouldn't want to help. You understand, right? And I want to understand. The weirdest thing's been happening since I've been speaking is I'll get African-American women coming up to me and say, you don't understand what it's like for me. Wendy, I loved your talk. I needed to hear it, but I have a double bind. And I realized I have white privilege. And wow, it kind of rocked me. Like, I so get it. White men don't understand the white privilege they have or the male privilege they have. So I said, okay, what am I to do about this? So now I'm trying to talk and actually ask African-American females what it's like for them in the environment. And I am amazed, and I was scared to ask. So I totally get where you're coming from, right? But if I say, hey, I've had kind of an epiphany that I have some white privilege, and I'm wondering if you'd have a conversation with me about that. I have had such great insight from it. So, and it all comes from that wanting to know, right? The fact that you even give a rip and you're worried about offending, that's a great place to start.
All right. The microphone.
Hello, hello.
Yep.
One of the things that's come up multiple times in this conversation is that the dynamic changes if you have, you know, at least one or more of whoever the underrepresented minority is in the room. And, you know, you'll see at this conference, yesterday on stage, today on stage, there's just not that many women there. And somebody also made the comment about being intentional about making sure that there are more of those faces at the table. I got into an argument just last month with a colleague about, well, yeah, but I don't want to focus on reverse discrimination. I don't want to just bring women in to bring women in. So what is the intentional, what do you do from an intentional perspective to make sure there is more representation? Because it does not exist, and I don't think the culture or the conversation changes until the representation changes.
I agree.
Definitely.
Well,
So how do you do that
when
without?
that changes when the people in power make those decisions. And until that happens, I don't know.
I mean, there's a Gina, the gender avenger, that sends out these all-male panels. And CES just had one. And it's trying to highlight it. And when they asked, why did you not find a female, they say we just couldn't find any, which is a cop-out. That's saying there's no qualified women, right?
I agree.
Which you should be ashamed of yourself for even saying that, right? So it is about going out and asking who are the right, how do I find these fabulous women that can be on this, on a panel or whatever it is. Last week, a woman told me she's in the Oracle space. She's one of the Oracle partners, and they were having their partner meeting, and she said, she's sitting with two other Oracle partners, and the Oracle guy said, we're doing the partner conference over in the Bahamas or somewhere great. We're trying to find panelists. And they said, well, what about, her name was Gina. And he said, no, it's a no vagina zone. And he said that out loud. So I am worried about, if that's the extreme, right? And so both the men spoke up actually and said, I think you're making a mistake, that Gina would be, she's the highest level of partner. She's good on stage. Neither one of us are in the position to want to do this, but I think you're missing out by not having Gina as part of that. And they spoke up for her, but I think it comes with that intention that you don't allow people just to get away with saying, I can't find the right qualified people.
Well, and to be fair, just to clarify, I know a lot of times that people are, I've done it myself, trying to get people onto panels, because what happens is my entire network ends up being a lot of white men.
Yeah.
So those are the people that I know to reach out to, and I've worked really, really hard lately to try to make sure to have more representation. But I know it's incredibly difficult. And my husband, who's a professor who does the same thing with panels, he's like, you have two women in the sphere of people, and everybody's trying to get them on their committee or on their panel or on their whatever.
Totally.
And it's really hard.
Well, and I think, look at this panel. We've got all women sitting up here. That in and of itself is inherently wrong.
Totally.
No offense whatsoever.
She did invite men, darn it.
Well, and there should be men up here, because men are the people that, as Wendy said earlier, that are going to help us partner in changing the culture. We've got a man with a question. Yay.
Yeah, we got two more. I want to.
So I think it would be great if men were up here that have had experience with this, that have brought hopefully cultural diversity to their workplace. And it's not just women, it's all underrepresented people.
Well, first of all, I want to say what a fantastic panel this has been. It's been riveting. So thanks for stepping up, especially you that had no warning about this, right? As you can tell from my accent, I didn't grow up in America. But I moved to America 4 years ago, and my wife did grow up in England and moved to America when she was 15. And so, and then we've been married 15 years. And so I've been puzzling over the differences between the United States environment and the British environment. And I've lived some of what you've been talking about through my wife, through proxy. I've been trying to figure out what are the differences, because certainly sexual harassment in the UK is absolutely a problem, right? But I don't recognize a lot of the behaviors that I've seen here. And I wonder what the differences are. And so I'm thinking it's really, maybe there's something to be learned about looking at some other places. For example, if you just look at the leadership in Europe, you see a lot more women in leadership roles. Let's take Maggie Thatcher, let's take Theresa May,
Right.
And you'll see the constituency of the British Parliament. Just look around, and you'll see many, many women there. Of course, it's work in progress, not perfect. but maybe there's something to be learned by going to look at where does it, because it starts before the workplace, doesn't it? I think you talked about how does a man that comes into the industry deal with women in the workplace. He just doesn't know. He's completely clueless. And so it starts before the workplace as well as in the workplace.
You're
and
right.
I think in the UK, something around the environment that I grew up in, where there's a sense of more equality somehow. Could be learned.
Yeah, I'm seeing lots of hands. But the movie Misrepresentation and the Mask You Live In that Jennifer Siebel Newsom has done, I don't know if anyone has seen that, either one of those movies, but it's a fascinating study of how we, as Americans, raise our boys versus raising our girls. And we teach them, and that is, you're absolutely right, this definitely starts at a very, very young age. We teach little boys, if you look at, she has all sorts of statistics and scientific data to support her documentary films. And boys and girls are born with the exact same emotional quotient. And we are just as emotional as little boys are, which I find fascinating. But we tell our little boys, I didn't tell my boys this, but my ex-husband did. Don't cry. Don't be such a wimp. I don't want to say that word. And we're still doing it.
Yeah.
And then we look at, so their perception then, little boys grow up with the perception that girls are the weaker sex because they're the ones that cry. They're the ones that play with dolls. I was a total tomboy, and it drove my mother nuts. She's like, why won't you wear a dress? I don't want to wear a dress. And I was thrilled when they changed the rules back in the 70s that girls could wear pants to school, but we were only allowed to wear pants to school one day a week. So the cultural inequities start when we're very young, and I'm seeing more and more of that now that I'm in the social impact investment world. I'm seeing a lot of energy focused on working with our children all around the world to really raise them as equals.
Very good point.
Because that will change as adults then.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, so this will be our last question, but hopefully everyone can hang out a
So
little
it's
bit.
not a question. As Don said, I think it's amazing that you ladies stood up and spoke out and were advocates. I spent, if you were here yesterday, I spent 42 years working for the Department of Defense. I'm proud to say that we had processes and training in place in the 70s to deal with this particular issue. There's a codification of what a hostile work environment is. And it's a very simple definition. If someone is offended or feels that they are in some way being displaced, they have the opportunity to raise that issue to their chain of command and have it worked. Now, the other thing that I would share with you, one of the things that and it was a natural thing for me, I grew up in a very diverse environment anyway, but diversity in the workforce is a force multiplier. And if your company or you don't have that as a core value in your thought process, you are missing out on making your company or yourself an exclusive, wonderful individual and a potentially superb leader. And what I see here is we've got to keep this dialogue going. And I would also make the observation, I didn't have daughters, I have 2 sons, but I have a beautiful granddaughter. And both of my very socially aware sons are protecting them and teaching them the kinds of moral value propositions about diversity and inclusivity. And if we don't do that as parents, this problem doesn't get fixed.
You're right. Thank you for that. That was excellent. Thank you.
Well, I wish we could go on for another hour because there's a lot more to discuss, but will you all please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists today? It's been a great discussion. Really appreciate your time.